and welcome back to another episode. Guys, this is episode 3 of Moses. We have learned so much about Moses. What I want to mention before we start this episode is that Moses is around 80 years old at this point. When he was a baby, he was called by God. When he was 40 years old, he ran away from Egypt and started a new family. And by the time he's about 80 years old is when he was approached by God for the burning bush. So before we continue, I just want to encourage you guys. If you haven't felt the calling of God yet for your entire life mission, remember that Moses wasn't called until he was an old man. So I say that to say this. Do not be discouraged if you aren't sure your role in God's mission yet. Just be patient, because Moses was patient and he waited for God. And we don't know when that time will come, but when it does, just make sure that you are ready to do so. And so let's dive in today to this episode and find out a little bit more about Moses. So, quick recap from last week. Moses runs away from Egypt for murdering a slave master. He starts a new family, and 40 years go by. He's 80 years old, and God calls him from a burning bush. God tells Moses to approach Pharaoh, who is basically the president of Egypt, and he demands that he let his people go. And after a lot of difficulty, Moses prevails. And Pharaoh finally lets the Israelites go. The Israelites are free. And if you remember, God destroys the Egyptian army in the process. So the Israelites have no enemies and they are free people. All is well. Until it wasn't. What we have to understand is that the Israelite people have been in control and obeying their slave masters for hundreds of years now. They do not know how to be a free people. I know that's hard to understand, but these people are just used to being told what to do. So they cling to Moses, and they ask him at every single step to guide them. And that's a big task. Moses has a lot of frustration and a lot of responsibility on his shoulder, but God is there for him. Now, we also have to understand that they are in a desert, okay? This place is hot, there's not a lot of water, and there's not a lot of food. But now they have to fend entirely for themselves, and Moses has to be the one to take care of this. This is a common theme that Moses has to deal with. Plenty of times the people are complaining about something, and every time Moses turns to God and God provides for them in some way or fashion. In one example, the people are hungry and Moses turns to God and God has food rain down from the heavens and the people are fed. Well, after a while, the people get tired of eating the same food, so they complain about that, and God provides them with something else. The entire time, the Israelites are completely unfaithful as well. They worship other gods, they murder each other, they disobey Moses, and things just don't work out for them. To make a long story short, the Israelites are disobedient and sinners and complainers. And God sentenced them to 40 years in the desert, where they just have to wander until they can get to their promised land. With all these responsibilities weighing down on Moses, and all these Israelites complaining and disobeying and causing trouble, it begins to get to Moses. Well, closer to the end of Moses' journey in the desert, it's been about 39 years the Israelites have been wandering it. Something happens, and once again the Israelites are complaining about water. They're complaining that they're never going to get water. They act like they've never seen God provide for them before. And Moses is fed up. Let's turn to Numbers chapter 20 in verse 6 and see what happens. Moses and Aaron went to the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." Moses agrees and he carries out God's plan. But you have to notice something very specific. God said to speak to the rock. Let's see what Moses does. In verse 10, he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Now, we have to take a close look here, because God told Moses to speak to the rock, and what did Moses do? He struck it twice. Now, I know that might not seem like a very big deal, but when you go against God, specifically what he says, it is a big deal. As a leader, Moses is looked at to all the time. And when he deliberately disobeyed God in front of all those people, it was a huge disrespectful moment towards God. In verse 12, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them.'" I know that sounds like a harsh punishment. Moses has been caring for the Israelites for so many years now, and he brings them to the promised land, almost inside the promised land, and he's not going to get to experience what God has planned for all the Israelites. Now, I know that seems harsh, but we have to understand that Moses was an important figure, and to disrespect God in front of all those people was a huge, huge insult. Also, Moses has not always been the most obedient servant. God has forgiven Moses and the Israelites for years and years and years of mistakes that they have made. And I'm not one to be able to justify the situation. That's up to God. But what we have to watch out for here is that anytime we have something, we have to make sure that we are honoring God in whatever we do. Not saying that God will punish you for that, because like I said, I'm not in charge of making that decision. But at any point in time, we need to watch our actions, because our actions are important to God, even if it is slapping a rock instead of speaking to it. God cares about everything that we do. Now, I want to go ahead and end our lesson there. And I know it was a short one, but the key point is that we do listen to God. God lays out very specific instructions for us, and we have to make sure that we're obeying these instructions, even down to the most minute commandment. So, before we end our lesson, I would like to go over some key points as usual. And number one is this: us as Christians do not escape sin more than anybody else. And in fact, we're held to a higher standard. James 3:1 puts it like this: "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." If you're a Christian, you should know the Bible, and you should know how to be able to teach it to other people. And sharing the gospel is teaching the Bible and the gospel to other people. And so, as Christians, we have a responsibility to know God's word and to deliberately obey it as much as we can. God holds us to a higher standard than the lost people of the world. We have to be intentional with our actions. And number two, when we commit ourselves to God, we have to follow through. Moses made the mistake of committing to God and then at the very end, pushing God away. Romans 6:1 gives us an idea of how to deal with this. "What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" The author of Romans is trying to say, just because we're saved doesn't mean that we should continue to sin. We now know something better. We know a better path. And because we have that better path, and because we've been saved by Jesus, we should continue to obey him all the time. I've heard this argument before, but some people might say, well, I'm saved now, and I'm not going to go to hell, so I can act however I want. Well, this verse targets that and says, just because you are saved doesn't mean you should continue to sin. We've been forgiven, and we owe it to God to obey him at every possible chance we can get. And number three is this: we have to count our blessings that God has given us. I think Moses did a very good job of counting his blessings, but I think the constant years and constant nagging of the Israelites got to him eventually. He was provided many things from God, but it all became too much for him, and he became angry, and he turned against God for the last time. And what I don't want for you guys to do is to hold any sort of resentment towards anybody, and especially God. When we do that, we get distracted from His mission and His plans for us. So I would like you to remember those three things. We have to continue to commit to God and try not to sin in the process, but always to follow His plan. And we have to remember what God has done for us in the past. And that's an exercise I want you to take to your small groups today. Recount the times that God has given you something, and recount the times that you might have forgotten. Or if you're anything like me, I've certainly asked God for something and He's given it to me, and then I forget to thank Him for that. And what we need to do, and what helps our hearts turn towards Him, is to remember those times and remember those blessings that He's given us. So I'm encouraged by Moses' story, and I hope you guys are too. There are many other things that Moses has done and a lot of other stories, and I encourage you to read in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus. He's done a lot of cool things and he's put up with a lot. But we got to learn from Moses and his mistakes, and ultimately, it'll turn us towards God. So thank you guys for watching this episode, and I'll see you guys next week.